It started with a sound no one ever forgets. Not an explosion, not a gunshot, something far worse. A sound that crawls beneath your skin and makes your stomach drop before your brain even understands what's happening. It was a groan, low and deep, like the earth itself warning of betrayal. Then came the snap, sharp, brutal, like a bone breaking under pressure, and then the crack. The kind of crash that makes the air shudder and time pause. Just long enough for you to realize something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. I was still halfway in my boots when I stumbled out of the front door. The morning sun hadn't even finished climbing over the ridge, and the air smelled like dust and something old, real old, something torn loose that had no business moving. Dust floated thick like smoke across the gravel lot, catching the light in ribbons, and through it I saw the silhouette wooden, gnarled, and no longer standing tall. My oak, my 82-year-old oak tree, the same tree my grandfather tied fence wire to when he first claimed this land, the one that shaded my goats in the summer and turned gold every fall like fire had kissed its branches. It lay sprawled across the field, limbs split open, crown shattered, like a fallen monument to something ancient and sacred, like a soldier shot in the back. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was her, Karen, standing there on the edge of the wreckage with arms folded, a cheap sun visor on her smug face, and a look like she'd just done the neighborhood a favor. No guilt, no shame, just that expression like she'd picked a ripe apple, not felled a tree older than her entire suburban HOA. For a second, I thought I might throw up, not from grief, from fury. My hands still had grease on them from the morning's work. I'd been out by the barn tightening loader arms on the tractor, that same tractor that now lay crushed beneath the oak, like a can under a boot. I didn't say anything, not a word, not because I was stunned, but because I knew that if I opened my mouth in that moment, something would come out that I couldn't take back, the kind of words that put a man behind bars. And she knew it. That's the part that haunts me. She knew. She saw the tree fall, saw what it landed on, and still stood there like she was checking an item off a to-do list. No hesitation, no apology, just leaned her head slightly and said, "You're welcome." Just like that, you're welcome. Like she'd done the world a favor. Like this was her land. Like that tree didn't have roots that reached further than her understanding of respect. Now you tell me, what would you have done in that moment? You come out and see a part of your history, your home, crushed by arrogance. What do you say when the person who caused it isn't even sorry? Are you supposed to stay calm, walk away, call the sheriff like a good little citizen, and hope someone gives a damn? Or do you do what every nerve in your body screams at you to do? You see, this didn't happen in a vacuum. Karen had been circling for years. Our ranch isn't part of the HOA, not by charter or by choice, but that never stopped her from trying to stake her claim. Flyers taped to my mailbox. Complaints about visual disruption when I repainted the barn red instead of taupe. Even a call to animal control because my goat bleated too early for her liking. I'd seen her type before, people who mistake community service for control, who think the title of board president gives them jurisdiction over everyone within shouting distance. But this was something else. 2 weeks before the fall, she came stomping up my drive with a clipboard in hand, and that smile that's never really a smile. She pointed at the oak, my oak, and said it was leaning dangerously over into HOA community sidelines. I told her, plain and simple, my land, my tree, your rules stop at that fence. I even showed her the metal marker embedded deep in the ground, weathered but still standing, like a silent witness to property boundaries drawn long before Karen ever picked up her first pink pen. She stormed off. Of course, but not before snapping photos with her phone. That should have been the warning bell. A few days later, a yellow notice was stapled to my fence, not my mailbox. Not the gate, but the actual fence post. Looked official if you squinted hard and ignored the typos. Claimed I had 48 hours to remove potential arboreal threat or risk immediate community action. I laughed, showed it to my neighbor Walt, who nearly choked on his iced tea reading it. We both thought she was bluffing. Turns out, she was serious. Serious and stupid enough to act without jurisdiction. And now here we were, me, standing in grease-stained jeans, staring at a tree I'd watched grow for over half a century, and her, standing like she just solved world hunger. The tractor was beyond repair. Loader arms snapped clean off, roll bar twisted. The driver's seat folded in like a paper cup. It looked like a tornado had passed through. But the real storm was standing upright in orthopedic sandals with a clipboard tucked under one arm. I pulled out my phone, started recording. She didn't even blink, didn't care, said she'd hired a local contractor to do the job. Wouldn't name him, had no permit. Just waved her hand like bureaucracy was beneath her and muttered something about community safety clause. That tree was a hazard. She said, it was only a matter of time. She said, better to be proactive. The same woman who once called a meeting to protest someone parking a boat trailer on their own driveway now thought she was the final authority on forestry management. I asked her again, whose land did she think she was cutting on? She gestured vaguely past the fence and said, it leans too far. That makes it public concern. I told her the trunk was 8 feet inside my line, that the tree had been there since before her subdivision had running water. She just rolled her eyes and muttered something about stubborn country folk. But I knew what it was. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about trees. It was about power. About someone who'd been told no too many times finally deciding that rules only applied when convenient. I kept filming, caught her admitting she hired the cutter, caught her brushing off the idea of permits, caught every arrogant shrug and flippant dismissal. And I knew, even then, that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. That tree had roots, not just in the soil, but in memory, in principle, in the very idea that land means something, that boundaries matter. Karen didn't just cut down a tree that day. She cut something far deeper. She severed respect, history, and in doing so, she dug her own grave, legal or otherwise. I stood there for hours after she left, watching the sunlight creep over the wreckage like it was trying to make sense of the scene. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just watched, listened to the stillness, and made a promise to myself. She thought the fall of that oak was the end of something, but it wasn't. It was the beginning. The storm hadn't passed. It had just changed shape, and I, for one, wasn't finished. Not until every inch of my land was restored and every inch of her arrogance exposed. You hear a sound like that, a groan, a crack, a crash, and something inside you shift. So I'll ask again, if it were you, standing on that porch, watching the dust rise, your land crossed, your work crushed, and your history lying dead at your feet, what would you do, and more importantly, what would you become? The morning after the tree fell wasn't just heavy, it was personal. The kind of weight that doesn't press down on your shoulders but seeps into your bones. Your breath, your coffee, even the goat stayed quiet. The stump sat there like a wound that hadn't scabbed yet, and the twisted remains of my tractor, still glinting with fractured chrome, felt more like a headstone than a machine. The sun was out, but it didn't feel warm. It felt like a spotlight on a crime scene no one else cared about. I didn't bother checking the weather. There was already a storm on my land, the real kind, not thunder and wind, bureaucracy and smug smiles. I hadn't even taken my first sip of coffee when I saw it. A white SUV rolling up slow, pretending not to mean trouble. It had the HOA logo on the door, like some kind of dollar store law enforcement vehicle, and a magnetic orange light perched on top, just in case anyone mistook it for a milk truck. And there she was again, Karen, stepping out like she owned gravity, clipboard in one hand, her visor perfectly angled to shield her from responsibility. She didn't look at me, didn't greet me, just walked right over to the stump like it had been waiting for her signature, took a few photos with her phone, scribbled something down like she was auditing a mistake in her spreadsheets. I asked, calmly as I could, whether she was here to apologize or just collect trophies. She didn't even blink, said, I'm here to document compliance. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so far past absurd that all that was left was that twitchy kind of humor people get when something breaks inside. Compliance. That's what she called it. The unlawful destruction of private property, reduced to a checkbox, as if the tree had just walked off on its own and flattened a machine on the way out. I took another slow sip of coffee, not because I wanted it, but because I needed something to do with my hands besides ball them into fists. I asked her, "What gives you the right to touch anything on this land?" And with that same robotic confidence, she quoted something about the HOA's Community Protection Clause, how it allowed it emergency action in cases of imminent danger or visual obstruction. Visual obstruction. She used that phrase like it was a legal scalpel. I asked who decided what counted as dangerous. She said the report came in anonymously. I smiled, because lies wear perfume when they're nervous. And I could still smell Karen's brand of cheap self-righteousness floating off that SUV like bug spray in summer heat. I reminded her, again, that the tree was on my land, clearly inside the property line, that the fence she so often sneered at was not decorative, it was a boundary. She shrugged. She actually shrugged, said something like, "Boundaries are flexible when public safety is at stake." That's when I realized this wasn't about safety. This wasn't about trees. This was about dominion. About the illusion of control. Karen didn't want to protect people. She wanted to remind them she was watching, that she could reach past the lines literally and figuratively because no one had stopped her yet. I pulled out my phone again, filmed her repeating everything she just said. She looked bored, like this was beneath her. But the camera doesn't care how you feel. It only records what you are. Later that day, I drove into town, not to cool off, not to buy supplies. I drove to make it real, to draw a line in ink where the land had already drawn one in soil. I walked into the sheriff's office with the video, the photos, the fake yellow notice she stapled to my fence, and my boundary survey papers from when I bought the land. The woman at the front desk barely looked up until I used the words destruction of property. Then she called out a name I hadn't heard before. A sergeant came out, older, sharper, the kind of man who didn't blink for drama or small talk. I laid it all out. He shook his head slowly, the way people do when they know something smells but can't say it out loud. He told me it was a strong case, but civil. I asked him, point blank, if I had cut down one of Karen's trees and flattened her garage, what would happen? He didn't answer, just told me to file the report and get a lawyer. I didn't hesitate. I knew exactly who to call. Dale Bishop, old friend. Former property attorney with a memory like a vault and a nose for blood in the water. I didn't need justice. I needed precision. I called him that night, invited him over, told him there to be brisket and beer. Dale wasn't a man who wasted time. He arrived with a folder already in hand. I hadn't even sent him anything yet. We walked the property line under flashlight, checked the survey markers, measured where the tree had stood. He whistled when he saw how far inside the fence it had been. She crossed the line, he said, literally and legally. He called it timber trespass, said the law was clear. If someone cut down a tree on land they didn't own, they owed triple the value of the tree, and that was just the start. There'd be damages for the tractor, destruction of personal property, trespassing, even if no criminal charges stuck. The civil penalties alone would sting. And Karen, she had handed me everything, on video, with her own smug voice. Dale told me to document everything, emails, texts, even old complaints she might have sent in. I told him about the time she threatened to install a beautification barrier between her subdivision and my pasture. He raised an eyebrow and said, let her dig her own hole. 2 days later, I saw the beginnings of a new fence going up, right on the western edge of the property, a couple of workers hammering posts into ground that clearly belonged to me. I didn't stop them, didn't shout. I just stood by the barn and took photos, quiet, unmoving, watching. It was obvious they were working from a bad sketch, Karen's idea of planning. The posts wandered like a drunk line of dominoes, dipping a good 5 feet into my field. I didn't say a word. Dale came back that evening, took one look at the pictures and laughed so hard he nearly dropped his beer. This isn't a lawsuit, he said. This is a slow-motion implosion. I started noticing more signs. The HOA newsletter Karen managed had a new section about tree hazards with a photo of my oak circled in red. No caption, no explanation, just fear marketing. HOA style. It backfired. People started asking questions. Neighbors I barely knew pulled me aside in the feed store. We saw the video. They said that was something. A few called it disgraceful. A couple even called her a dictator with a sun visor. Word was spreading. And Karen, for all her posturing, had nothing to stand on. No law, no permits, no allies, but she still wouldn't back down. Instead, I got an email from her HOA account demanding that I immediately remove all stump and debris left behind, claiming it was a visual nuisance impacting neighborhood property values. I didn't reply. I printed it out, handed it to Dale. He read it and chuckled, said, "We'll use this too." Every move she made was like another knot in the rope she was tying around herself. I spent that night in the barn, not working, just standing there, watching the stars through the gaps in the roof, breathing in the quiet, and all I could think about was how quickly someone could cross a line they didn't own and believe it made them right. Karen hadn't just touched my tree. She'd cut through the root of something deeper, something that stretched back generations. And she didn't even know it. She thought this was over. But the ground was just starting to shift beneath her feet. The question now wasn't if she'd fall. It was how hard. The wind picked up the morning the surveyor arrived. Not strong enough to knock anything down, but just enough to make every piece of loose paper flap like a warning. I stood at the edge of my property, boots planted in cracked soil, arms crossed, watching the white SUV return to Karen's driveway like it had some kind of business being there. This time, she didn't get out right away. Just sat inside, engine idling, windows rolled up, probably watching me the same way I was watching her. But I wasn't there to argue, not anymore. I was there to measure, to document, to draw the line again legally, surgically. The surveyor, Martin, according to his clipboard, was a quiet man, early 40s, sun-worn, with a GPS receiver mounted to a harness and two assistants who moved like they'd done this 1,000 times. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Dale had already briefed them. Their job wasn't to investigate. It was to confirm what I already knew, that the fence Karen had ordered was built on my land, that the tree she felled stood well within my boundaries, and that this wasn't just a neighborly dispute. It was a violation in every measurable way. They planted little orange flags into the ground, one after another, forming a trail of truth through the tall grass and cracked gravel. I offered them coffee, not out of politeness, but to make sure they stayed long enough to finish every minage. One of the assistants, a younger guy with sharp eyes and a quiet voice, pointed out that the fence posts dipped over 5 feet inside the line. I told him not to say anything to her. Not yet. Let her finish the entire thing. Every last board, every last nail. Let her build her own mistake into something undeniable. By the time the sun started leaning west, I had a map, coordinates, timestamps, and photographic evidence stacked neatly on my kitchen table. Dale arrived not long after, flipping through the files like a man opening Christmas presents. He grinned at every photo, every measurement, every blip on the GPS report that confirmed what we already knew. She'd crossed the line, not once, not just with the tree, but with the fence, with the assumptions, with her mouth. And now, we had it all down in writing. The thing about land disputes is, they're never really about land. They're about power, about control, and about which party has the patience to see it through. Karen never understood that part. She thought making noise was the same as making progress. But noise fades, evidence doesn't. Over the next few days, I began collecting everything I could. Old photos from when I first moved in, aerial drone footage from the county assessor's archive, even screenshots of HOA newsletters that she'd accidentally emailed to non-members, trying to build some case in the shadows. One issue had a grainy picture of my oak tree, circled in red. Under the headline, "Dangerous Encroachments." No explanation, just an image and some implied threat. It was propaganda, sure, but in a small town, Even propaganda leaves fingerprints. Dale helped me organize it all into folders, digital and physical. One labeled property evidence. Another, HOA communications. And a third, simply, Karen. Inside that one was every printed email, every memo with her name on it. And yes, even screenshots of social media posts where she'd commented passive-aggressively about unsightly rural holdouts clinging to dead trees. She didn't mention me by name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew. People started talking, not just to me, but about her. A couple I'd only seen in passing stopped by one morning. The woman, Katie, held a pie like it was a peace offering. The man, Ryan, shook my hand and said, "It's about time someone stood up to her." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't used to being anyone's symbol, but I nodded, accepted the pie, and invited them to stay for coffee. They told me stories how Karen had fined them for putting up a non-conforming mailbox, how she once ordered a landscaper to remove a tree in a neighbor's yard because she said it looked melancholic. Her word. Melancholic. Like nature had an aesthetic quota to meet. I listened, not because I needed confirmation of what she was, but because I needed to understand how deep her roots had spread. They weren't legal roots. They were social, psychological. People had tolerated her for years because it was easier than confronting her. But now, the tide was turning. And every quiet nod I received at the feed store, every hushed good luck at the post office, was another chip in the armor she'd built around herself. Still yandano. She didn't back down. Not completely. She sent another email, this one from a generic HOA address. It was cold, clinical, and unsigned. It stated that my fallen tree presented a continued visual disruption and that I was expected to comply with community guidelines by removing all debris within 7 business days. 7 business days. Like this was a transaction. Like my land was a spreadsheet. I printed it, highlighted the phrase community guidelines, and mailed it straight to Dale. He called me that night and said, "She just gave us Exhibit C." Meanwhile, the fence was almost done. Same crew, same sagging line of boards dipping across my pasture like a mistake too arrogant to correct itself. They worked on, unaware or pretending to be that the work they were doing would be undone the moment a court ruled. I kept my distance, filmed, took notes, logged the date and time of each new post. Karen, for her part, had gone strangely quiet. No more confrontations, no more clipboard strolls, just the occasional glimpse of her through the blinds of her kitchen window, peering out like a monarch watching an uprising. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived, no return address. Inside was a cease and desist letter. From a law firm in the next county over, Karen was accusing me of defamation, claimed my video posts and drone footage had damaged her reputation, incited harassment, and caused emotional distress. No mention of the tree, no mention of the tractor, just a full-page tantrum wrapped in legal formatting. Dale read it over coffee, didn't even flinch. "It's weak," he said, "but we'll take it seriously, and we'll answer it." And we did. Our response was precise. Timelined, supported with photos, permits, survey data, and public records. Then we countersued, officially, for damages to the tractor, for trespassing, for unauthorized tree removal, for the full appraised value of the oak, and, yes, for punitive damages, not out of spite, but because she needed to understand that actions have weight. And this wasn't a warning anymore. This was consequence. Court was set for 2 weeks later, and in that time, the town began to change. The HOA newsletter skipped an issue. Karen's yard, once trimmed with military precision, grew patchy. A for sale sign appeared on one of her inner circle neighbors' lawns. And Karen, she stopped showing up to HOA meetings altogether. At least in person, I heard whispers of Zoom calls, of quiet reshuffling, of apologies drafted but never sent. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I knew better than to count unhatched chickens, but something had shifted. The air was different. The silence in the neighborhood was no longer tense. It was peaceful. And the bench I'd carved from the oak's fallen trunk had started drawing attention. People stopped sat down, took photos, asked questions, and I told them the same story. Over and over again, not with anger, but with clarity. A tree was cut, a boundary was crossed, a line was drawn, and what came next wasn't revenge, it was restoration. The kind that doesn't grow overnight, but the kind that lasts. The courthouse smelled like old wood, coffee, and the kind of anticipation that clings to people who are about to find out if the world still makes sense. I arrived early, wore a clean button-up and my best jeans. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I wanted to look like what I was, a man who took care of his land and was now here to defend it. Dale met me out front, his briefcase in one hand, legal pads tucked under the other arm. Dressed in the same charcoal gray blazer I'd seen him wear when he got his final ruling before retirement. He didn't talk much, just nodded once. The kind of nod that said, "We were ready." Karen arrived 20 minutes later in a navy blue pantsuit that looked like it had never been worn outside of air conditioning. She stepped out of her car like she was still in control of something, but her eyes told a different story. They darted around the lot, scanning for allies that weren't there. Her lawyer followed behind her. A younger man with gelled hair and shoes, too shiny for any courtroom with real dirt in the parking lot. Inside, the judge was already seated, older, gruff, the kind of man who didn't care about pleasantries or posture. He called our case without looking up from the stack of folders on his bench and motioned for us to begin. Dale started, calm, measured, every word deliberate. He laid out the timeline with a surgeon's precision, photos of the tree before it fell, the surveyor's certified report, GPS data, footage of the crash, statements from neighbors, even the fabricated notice Karen had stapled to my fence. Each piece clicked into place like fence posts in solid ground. He spoke with clarity, not anger, because the facts didn't need volume to be powerful. The courtroom was still. Karen's lawyer tried to redirect the argument, talked about intentions, about perceived danger, about good faith actions on behalf of the community. But each time he tried to pivot, Dale brought it back to one thing: the law, the property lines, the lack of a permit, the admission, caught on camera, that Karen had hired someone to cut a tree on land she didn't own, and the damage quantified, photographed, undeniable. At one point, Karen stood up and tried to explain herself. She said she was only trying to prevent a tragedy, that the tree looked unstable, that the tractor being parked underneath it was not her fault. But her voice cracked halfway through and she couldn't meet the judge's eye. He asked her one question, just one: did you have written permission to remove the tree? She hesitated, looked to her lawyer, then said, "No." But the judge raised a hand and cut her off. "That's all I needed to know." He turned back to Dale, asked for damages. Dale handed over a spreadsheet with 3 columns: tractor value, appraised tree worth, and civil penalties under the state's timber trespass laws. The number wasn't outrageous, but it was heavy, 87,000 and change. The judge took it, glanced at it, nodded, and without another word, ruled in our favor. Karen's defamation claim was dismissed outright. Her lawyer didn't even protest. He just closed his folder and stared at the table. The ruling was clear, final, in public. She had 30 days to pay or risk a lien on her property. When it was over, I stood outside the courthouse and took a breath that felt like it went all the way down to my boots. Dale clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Justice tastes a little like stale coffee, doesn't it?" We laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was finally done, or so we thought. The next morning, the check hadn't arrived, but something else had: a letter from the HOA board, official letterhead this time. It stated that Karen's actions had not been authorized, that the HOA did not support her unilateral decision to remove the tree or install the fence, and that they would be conducting an internal review. They offered to pay for the removal of the fence and asked if I would delay further legal action in good faith. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I forwarded it to Dale and went outside to where the fence still stood, crooked and defiant like a failed argument. The workers came 2 days later to tear it down. A new crew, quiet, efficient. No Karen, just the sound of metal posts being yanked out of earth they never should have touched. I watched from the porch, arms folded, the wind brushing across the field like the land itself was exhaling. A few neighbors drove by slowly, waving. One honked, one gave me a thumbs up. None of them stopped, but none of them looked away either. The bench I'd made from the oak's trunk had started becoming something of a local attraction. People came to see it, sit on it, take photos, ask questions. I added a small sign next to it. Let the roots remember. It wasn't just for the tree, it was for the principle. The reminder that just because something is old doesn't mean it's obsolete. That sometimes what looks like just another tree is actually the spine of a whole story. Then, out of nowhere, a black car pulled into the drive one evening. I paused mid-step, holding a sack of feed. The windows were tinted, the engine idle low. The passenger window rolled down. Karen, no visor, no clipboard, just her face, bare and smaller than I remembered. She didn't get out, just sat there for a minute, then said she'd send the check within the week, that she wasn't going to appeal, and then she said sorry. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, it was soft, quiet. She said she got caught up in the power, that she thought she was doing what was best. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, and after a moment, I said, "This land has roots. Karen, deeper than you knew." She nodded, rolled up the window, drove away without looking back. And that was it. The check arrived 5 days later. Full amount. No tricks, no notes. I deposited it the next morning and called the equipment dealer I'd spoken to weeks before. A few days after that, a new tractor arrived. Bigger, better, every bolt tight, every seam clean. I named her Karen Crusher, not out of spite, out of memory, because she would be the reminder that even when things fall, something stronger can grow from it. I polished her myself, took her through the east pasture, and felt the soil give under her wheels like it was welcoming her home. The sun hit just right, and for the first time in months, the land didn't feel like a battleground. It felt whole. I didn't throw a party, didn't toast victory. I just worked, fixed the gates, repaired an irrigation line that had gone dry during the mess, built a new shelter for the goats. Life didn't stop. It just shifted, settled into a steadier rhythm. And all the while, that bench sat near the old stump, waiting, not for revenge, but for reflection, a place for people to sit and remember that some lines should never be crossed. And if they are, well, some roots still run too deep to pull. A few weeks had passed since the last nail was pulled from the fence, and the air had started to carry in that early sign of fall the scent of dry hay, warm soil, and something subtle in the wind. Like time finally letting go, Karen's house sat quiet at the end of the road. The shutters were still closed. The lawn, once trimmed like it was inspected by laser, had turned patchy, uneven, like even the grass had stopped listening to her orders. I passed by her place now and then on my way into town, and every time I saw it silent, still, untouched, I felt something not quite like victory. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't joy, it was a kind of grounded peace. The kind you only get after something ugly has worked its way out of the soil and died in the sun. I never saw her again, not in person, not even in passing. No more HOA newsletters, no more poorly disguised citations, just absence. Like she'd packed not only her bikes, but her presence. And maybe that's what she needed to vanish. Or maybe she stayed inside, waiting for time to rewrite her story. But out here, time remembers differently. A couple moved into the house not long after, Ryan and Katie, mid-30s. City folks who wanted something slower, something real. They showed up in flannel and worn boots like they'd read a guidebook on rural living. But there was no pretense about them, no speeches, no clipboards. They knocked on my door with a smile and a question about soil, about water lines, about which fields held their sun the longest. I gave them the straight answers, told them where the frost hit first, how to avoid the drainage ditch in spring, where the wildflowers bloomed best if they wanted to try bees. They listened, took notes, And when they asked about the story behind the bench by the stump, I told them the shortened version, that a neighbor once forgot where the lines were, that something got cut down that didn't belong to her, that sometimes trees fall, and sometimes people do too. But the important part isn't the falling. It's what you build from what's left standing. Ryan nodded like he understood. Katie asked if she could sit on the bench for a moment. I told her it was built for exactly that. Later that week, I got a call from someone at the county office, said they were organizing a small panel at the fall festival. A talk about rural property rights, neighbor disputes, and how landowners could protect themselves legally. Said someone had passed my name along, probably Dale. I didn't say yes at first. I've never been much for microphones or folding chairs under tents, but he told me I didn't need to speak like a lawyer. Just tell my story. Honestly, simply, like I would to a neighbor. So I said, all right. I showed up early that Saturday morning, wore the same shirt I'd worn to court, and stood under a white canopy next to two people I'd never met. One a woman who'd won a fence dispute against a big developer. The other a man who'd reclaimed public easement from a false claim made by his HOA. They spoke well, clear, smart. And when it was my turn, I didn't try to impress anyone. I just told it like it happened. I told them about the tree, about the tractor, about a woman with a clipboard who thought rules only mattered when they benefited her. I talked about the survey lines, the drone footage, the fence posts that cut like teeth into my pasture. I didn't use big words, didn't try to win the room, just said the truth and let it settle. People clapped, not loud, but honest. Afterwards, several folks came up to shake my hand. A man from the next county told me about his battle with a neighbor who rerouted a ditch and flooded his barn. A woman with calloused hands said she once caught her HOA measuring her yard with a laser pointer to see if her Christmas decorations cast unauthorized light. We weren't there to complain. We were just people who had been pushed 1 inch too far. And something about sharing that space, that quiet recognition that we weren't alone, made the whole damn mess feel like it mattered. Back at the ranch, the new tractor hummed like it had been born on this land. Every bolt snug, every gear smooth. I used it to clear the south field. And as I worked, I passed the bench by the stump. And without thinking, I slowed down, parked, got out, sat for a while with the engine ticking behind me. The wind moved through the tall grass, brushing it like an old friend. And for a moment, I remembered everything. The noise, the fall, the crushing weight, the silence after. I ran my hand along the bench. The oak slab had dried to a deep golden brown. The grain twisted like muscle. I'd stained the legs twice, sealed the top with oil. And every time it rained, the water beat it and rolled off like the wood didn't mind anymore. I added a plaque under the seat later that week. It wasn't for me. It wasn't even for Karen. It was for every person who ever had to raise their voice just to be heard. It read, "To those who stand their ground, not in defiance, but in dignity." It wasn't long after that I noticed the for sale sign vanish from Karen's yard. A new truck in the drive, a dog barking through a screen door. The past had moved on, quietly, like a shadow lifting at sunrise. I didn't think about her much anymore, not directly, but sometimes, late at night, when I stood on the porch sipping tea and listening to the cicadas. I'd look at the dark stretch of road that led to her old house and wonder how many other places had stories like this. Quiet wars fought over fences and trees and the illusion of power. I never sought revenge, but I got justice. And more than that, I got clarity about who I was, about where my lines were drawn, and about what it means to be rooted, not just in soil, but in principle. Months later, I received a handwritten letter from someone I didn't know, said they'd driven 2 counties over to see the bench, sat on it, took a photo, said it reminded them of their father's farm, said it made them feel heard, even without words. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer where I keep the first photo I ever took of that oak tree back when I thought trees lasted forever. Maybe some do, not in bark, not in leaves, but in what they make us remember. And now, as the season turns, as the nights stretch longer and the air sharpens with that early edge of frost, I look out over my land and know this: I will never let someone like her cut through what matters again. The roots here run deep, and if anyone ever forgets, the bench is still there, waiting.